Digital Society, an irregular podcast about life with technology produced by Dr. Travis Holland, that's me, at Charles Sturt University. I'm going to have a chat today with Martin Feld, who is working in digital communication and also undertaking PhD research into podcasting at the University of Wollongong. Hi, Martin.
Hello, Travis. Thank you so much for having me. It's kind of actually a little bit funny to be on this side of the microphone because doing podcasts, I'm normally in host mode. So, yeah, this is a nice shift.
It's interesting having conversations with podcasters because you do kind of wrestle each other for the microphone a little bit.
Oh, don't worry. I won't be threatening your role in any way. This is your podcast. I get it.
I thought we could have a chat about a couple of different topics. Let's start with convergence. Now, convergence and the notion of convergence culture was really influentially described by Mr Jenkins, a professor in the US, to mean the flow of content across multiple media platforms. We might unpack this a bit as we go, but the flow of content across multiple media platforms, cooperation between multiple media industries, and the migratory behaviour of audiences who would go anywhere in the search of the kinds of entertainment experience they want. So Jenkins then says convergence is a word that describes technological, industrial, cultural, and social changes. Lots of media makers, it's pretty important to think about what convergence culture means for practice, I think. It's not just an academic term. It does kind of describe what you're actually dealing with in a day-to-day basis. You know, how do you choose the right platform for audiences? Does the content feel seamless and integrated? And is there cross-industry and cross-platform relationships? Huge question to start. What's your sort of take on that, Mark?
It is a big question, yeah. So in preparing for this this show, to be honest, I actually did very little preparation. We want it to be a flowing conversation, don't we? I was thinking about this idea of convergence and what we essentially live in today. And when Jenkins was writing about this stuff, or a lot of different academics were thinking about these ideas, I think it was relatively early days, right?
Mm-hmm.
In all of this. I mean, we could see nerds or communities online kind of interacting with this thing, but now we're all kind of living and breathing this every day. So what was once a kind of future thinking nerdy concept is now flowing through mainstream culture and communities online and offline every single day. So when I look at convergence, I like the way that Jenkins kind of defined it not only as convergence culture, that is not just being about technological convergence, things coming together in devices like iPhones or black set-top boxes and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually that convergence of information, of narrative experiences. It's that kind of reshaping of our minds to dance between different devices and hardware to have that convergent experience. And I think that's what we're all kind of drowning in at the moment in a way.
Yeah, it's something also that does drive the design decisions even of Apple, right? Apple really wants their content to flow across different devices. And we've seen with the release of their VR headset, which Apple Vision Pro, I want to say, is what it's called, that their plan is to make seamless integrations of your content across all the Apple devices and the Apple ecosystem. That is, for you, would you think that seems like an element of convergence as well?
I do agree. Apple Vision Pro is a good example to throw out there as a very new, recent announcement. And I think Apple's always been particularly famous for their ecosystem. That idea that, you know, whether it was the Mac or the iPod or the iPhone and the iPad, all these products that have come out, and even now the watch and the headset, the fact that there's this interactive, integrated environment of devices where it all just works, as was the saying, it just works, as Steve Jobs used to say, and that your stuff is everywhere without having to think about it or change the way that you behave or find your information. The Vision Pro is an interesting example in the sense that it's, and I'm forgetting the name of who I think Jenkins cited here, but the idea of being in this prolonged media transition through convergence. And I think we're now seeing another transition within the transition. So mainstream society has gotten used to that idea of having everything in its pocket with something like an iPhone, drawing from the technological shifts of things like iPods and Macs before them. And everyone has that in their pocket. They know that if they want to find their photos or chat with friends or listen to music or whatever, it's all through that. But now we have this new device, which is a convergence of all these technologies within that ecosystem sitting on the face. It's a new kind of social paradigm where, yes, an iPhone is a personal device, but you can show someone next to you what's on that screen. You can kind of converge as a group around that screen, whereas this is almost a divergent device in the sense that it's splitting off into this individual private space where you're shut off from the world. Hence, they add things like the eyesight to the front. So we're seeing a transition to a new kind of social interaction or technology, drawing from the tech that's come before, but a different user mode, I suppose.
Yeah, I really like that comparison because often, there's this kind of moral panic around the use of phones and particularly, I guess, younger people sitting around, everyone looking at their phones. But quite often what you'd find in that situation, if you were speaking to the people involved, is that they were playing games with each other, or they were communicating with each other, or they were ensuring that people who aren't in the room with the group still feel like they were in the room with the group. And then one of the most common behaviors you see people do with phones is, pick the phone up and show someone something else. Hey, look what I've just seen. What do you think of this? And then that sparks conversations. That's not something that's going to happen with the Vision Pro, is it? Or with other headset devices like that.
That's exactly right. I agree with you. And then I think, and of course, now I'm just kind of speculating at this point, but then you start to see maybe over time as successive generations of these kinds of mixed reality headsets come out, you'll maybe start to see over-engineered technological solutions to the removal or hindrance of those once normal social practices. So kind of like how you see that share play feature, during COVID, for example, when now we can share the shows that we're watching on our Apple TVs or our iPhones with other people. Now suddenly my face is covered, but I want to share something that's happening in a game or a movie with someone else. So you can imagine all these people sitting in maybe the shared or different spaces going, let me beam to you what's currently beamed to my eyes, even though you can't see on the outside. So yeah, it's this kind of juggling or balancing act of how do we make this socially appropriate and make it convenient for everyone to enjoy all of their information as it stands.
I can almost see them building a projector in so you can look at a wall and say to your friends, here, look what I'm seeing, and it projects out.
Yeah, actually, that's probably an even better example. Yeah, it makes it physical or shared in the space. I think your logic is better
to share it to someone else. I don't use Apple, actually. I'm an Android user, but when you share AirDrop, is it? AirDrop something to someone.
I've got this 4K video that I recorded on my phone now, pop it up on the TV. Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. This notion of media convergence, though, probably still represents or presents some challenges to media industries and to audiences and players in the field, people working in media production and communication. What are some of those challenges you think might be out there in the form of convergence?
I think it's actually, I think convergence, like anything really, pick any topic, even like globalization, something as broad as that, for example, I think they're double-edged swords. So when it comes to convergence, we see more open communication and production, right? Which is democratizing. You look at that and you go, wow, anyone like a 13-year-old at home who has access to a computer can now suddenly become a YouTuber, or someone in stereotypical middle age who has never used a computer might get into writing a blog or something. And there are all of these more accessible, affordable ways of using convergent devices and information streams to put power of communication into people's hands like never before. But then at the same time, as you see this kind of rise of, amateurs and artists who have these powers to communicate, you also see the rise of things like mis or disinformation. People who are no longer the traditional idea of the expert and who have that open access, which is a great thing in principle, can now spread ideas that once would never have made their way onto the front of a newspaper. It might have been like reserved for that somewhat crazy letter to the editor style situation, and they would have been put in their box. So what was once, just the soapbox on the town square or the letter to the editor, these convergent devices and ideas have allowed that springing up of these challenging, flourishing of ideas that once would have been put down.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've been playing with an idea recently, thinking about the notion of science communication in quite a lot of my work. The one thing we often see is that academics and scientists are encouraged to become their own communicators and their own promoters, to all have their own websites and all have their own social media accounts and doing science communication if you're on the sort of science side of things. And I think that's a useful skill. But I also have to wonder, even in that situation, right, where they are all experts, whether you really need every geologist out there doing geology communication or whatever it happens to be, whether every astronomer needs to be out there running their own YouTube channel. Or whether there should be group channels, or whether there should be people who are acting as kind of mediators again, and helping to shape what the field is communicating as a group in a sort of more defined way. So those are, um, I think, some of those other challenges that again, if you put the technology in everyone's hand and the capability in everyone's hand, and suddenly everyone is communicating and producing content. And what do we do with all that content? It becomes a problem to actually find your way through the flood of material.
Absolutely.
Um, so if we look back at this notion of convergence, Jenkins says it describes technological, industrial, cultural, and social changes. And we've kind of mentioned some technological changes, perhaps some of the social changes, and even we're starting to get towards the notion of cultural changes in terms of the production, the creation of cultural content, I guess. What industrial changes do you think we might be getting out of out of convergent technology?
One that springs to mind straight away as you ask that question is actually thinking more about, for example, traditional media like broadcast news and how that as an industry has been affected by the always
Mm,
on culture of the web and social media. So, on the one hand, you see traditional media threatened by these convergent technologies and cultures, these publics or techno publics online. And we see things like, pick your company, Facebook or Meta, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, constantly pumping out all of this content that you just said very well before. How do we keep track of all this content? It's just up all the time. And then that kind of social pressure of always being on, always being fed through these algorithms feeds into well, how do we as broadcast media keep up with this? Where do we get our
mm,
information? How do we attract eyes to the TV streaming service or the digital kind of terrestrial TV when everyone's looking at feeds somewhere else? And that kind of reinvigorates that hyper news cycle, that machine of trying to pump stuff out, which then feeds back into the media like the X/Twitter, and it just kind of goes into this kind of social hyperdrive. So I think industrially, you see people trying to adapt traditional models to keep up with the new, and then it just becomes even more chaotic as no one really can switch off anymore.
Of the attention economy, right? That what
Mm,
any media producer really is selling, and I use that term really broadly. It could be everyone from from Netflix or a news company to an author, but what anyone is really selling is attention,
mhm.
or they're trying to attract attention with their content, whatever that content happens to be. And if you are struggling to do that, it doesn't matter how valuable or important your content is, whether it's news or whatever, um, because people have so much of it at hand. You know, yeah, attracting that attention is a problem. So
Yeah, and you mentioned, if I can just interrupt there, sorry, like Netflix, for
no, go.
example. I think talking about more of the new media industry, if we can put it that way, you see convergent technologies or convergence of things like TV into streaming services,
Mm,
things that were once, oh, TV is not as good as movies, cinema is where it's at, right? But now TV is cultural king essentially. And while all of that has happened through convergent technologies, we're now seeing fragmentation or divergence in how we actually get to that content. So it almost seems like a bit of an oxymoron or a paradox that we're now going into different places through convergent technologies where you used to just watch your cable TV in the US or just used to go to the cinema. Now we have to have multiple subscriptions that have all fragmented or been siloed, even though the technology is itself pushing through one device, for example.
yeah, the subscription fatigue
Yeah.
is one of the things you're getting at. There is a potential problem. we've gotten to a situation where content was free and available, and in fact there is still so much content as we've always talked about, but the sort of quality content is increasingly getting put behind those paywalls again and harder to get hold of. So the other industrial sort of change that I think we can point to potentially as part of convergence is increasingly companies merging with other companies and viewing media in a more holistic way. So you could point to Walt Disney and Disney Company as being, someone who buys up lots of other companies, and they don't just buy other media companies. Of course, famously, they have in recent years bought Lucasfilm and Marvel and Fox, and so they are buying traditional media companies. But then just last week or the week before, they bought a huge stake in Epic Games as well. So all of a sudden, we're seeing convergence become manifested at the industrial level through vertical integration and through the same companies owning properties in sort of all media all at once, and then potentially pushing stories through all media. So, the link between convergence culture and the notion of transmedia becomes really obvious when you point to somebody like Disney and say, well, how could they push out the latest Marvel movie through Disney Plus, through the cinema, through or the latest Marvel story, let's call it, through Disney Plus, through the cinema and through games all at the same time.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up the example of Disney and Epic, because if we're talking about convergence culture, if I can refer to something that I'll call, I'm sure someone said this before, but like convergent corporate culture, Disney and Apple for the longest time have been very good friends, people on each other's boards and that sort of thing. And in recent times, Epic's Fortnite has not been on the iOS App Store.
Yeah.
And Disney now has a stake in the very game or company that has been at kind of lockerheads with Apple. So you kind of see a kind of challenging of the convergent corporate cultures and friendships that, for example, Apple once used to enjoy with Google, competing smartphone platforms and mapping services, and they start to diverge. So there's this ebbing and flowing of corporate friendships as well based on all of this convergence.
Yeah, and the two dominant app stores, I guess the Play Store from Google and the App Store are another example of that as well, that they're kind of the world's major competitors in that space now. And of course, they're not the only sort of stores, but when you have the two dominant phone platforms, then that's how that works. And there have been some challenges that Epic has been challenging in court Apple's dominance and use of those spaces and their pricing practices in those spaces as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out with that relationship with Disney. Absolutely. Yeah. And then you get someone like, you get someone like Meta, who of course has bought WhatsApp and Instagram over the years, and just kind of keeps buying up these companies as well. So, growth through acquisition has been a big thing in the tech world for the last 20 years, but it's absolutely also very much alive and well in the normal media world, and certainly something we could point to, I think, as an example of media convergence.
Totally agree.
Any other really standout examples of successful media convergence to you? What do you point to and say that is prime sparkling media convergence? It comes from the convergence region of France.
The convergence region of France. I should visit. I haven't been there, actually. I haven't had the pure experience of convergence. Convergence, is that how you say that?
Yeah. I think probably Silicon Valley is the...
yeah. That's the translation in English, yeah. Actually, thinking back to when I first read Jenkins, there was that discussion of things like knowledge cultures, and I think it was, you can correct my pronunciation of, is it Pierre Levy? He did Collective Intelligence around transmedia storytelling like The Matrix. Now, it wouldn't be a podcast with me if I didn't bring up The Matrix. I'm kind of known for doing that. But when I think about that, was like a formative experience in like my childhood at primary school. And I look at that as a kind of transmedia example of convergence of storytelling and technology. And for people who aren't as familiar with the franchise, or maybe have just watched that one film, a lot of my thinking about technology, media, the things that I enjoy, whether it's in sci-fi or not, come from that experience of what the Wachowski sisters did at that time, of not only telling a story through the core medium of cinema, but heaping comics on top of that, games,
Yeah.
short film, animated anthologies. It was just an amazing kind of experience, and I think a kind of turn of the century model for the best practice of convergent or transmedia storytelling. And everything that I kind of view after that, whether it's like Star Wars Visions, the animated anthology, or what Marvel has essentially done with its universe, everything just seems like a copy of that experience to me, and never quite satisfies. So sorry if that seems a bit negative about everything that's come since, but in terms of a template for how to do convergent storytelling, I think The Matrix is king.
Yeah, the what I start to think about there, and not that I mean, The Matrix was produced by Warner Brothers, right? So it's not
Mhm.
not as if we're talking about a small media company,
No.
but that origin, uh, that's not the right word. It's not really the origin of transmedia storytelling, but that kind of popularization of transmedia
Yes.
storytelling, the moment at which it became a thing in the public consciousness,
Mm.
and then probably became a template that others started to copy and adapt to, and that's what we see. I mean, Disney's really the a high watermark of that now. But it reminded me, as you were talking, of a quote from The Simpsons. So this,
Mm.
I shoehorn references to Jurassic Park and The Simpsons into pretty much everything. Um,
Billy and the Clonosaurus, right?
yeah, but there's a quote from The Simpsons where they're talking about love, and Lisa says to the family, "Romance is dead. It was acquired in a hostile takeover by Hallmark and Disney, homogenized and then sold off piece by piece."
I remember that.
and and it made me think about transmedia storytelling in the same way, right? Transmedia storytelling originating with the Matrix again into that kind of public consciousness or the
Mm.
public sphere, most obviously, and then Disney does this version of it, which is very much a homogenized cookie cutter approach to transmedia storytelling instead of kind of experimental. I think so. Yeah, that's a really interesting outcome of that way of telling stories.
I think that's a
Um,
very fair use of that quote too. I agree with that.
well, otherwise I'll start quoting Jurassic Park. So
By all means.
take a bit of a look at social media and especially some of the impacts that social media sort of has on society, if that's okay. We could we have a think about how social media might strike a balance, or how we can strike a balance between using social media in a positive way and perhaps avoiding some of the negative consequences. Because I guess that's one of the concerns that people have about social media, right? Is that it's impacting negatively on our relationships, but also it has the potential for these connections. So, what kinds of balance can we strike there?
Balance is a really good word. Moderation comes to mind as well. And moderation is not a word that I think springs to many people's minds when they think about the use of technology or social media in particular. And, you were talking about Apple before or other tech companies. When Steve Jobs got on stage in 2007 and announced the original iPhone, for anyone who hasn't seen that keynote, he introduced it as, like this widescreen iPod with touch controls, massive cheers, a revolutionary mobile phone, cheers, a breakthrough internet communicator. That sounds all right. Like, no one really understood what was to come. And I don't think Apple even did. They're not terribly well known for being a social media company. So all of the things that were kind of flourishing or that have come about or become mainstream because of those convergent technologies that we were just talking about, this is now the social media environment that we operate. And people have a lot of trouble trying to moderate their experience of that, or detach or diverge, let's say, the physical in-person experiences that they have from the digital. And I think, sometimes the devices themselves can be used to strike that balance. I mean, Apple has its screen time feature. I'm sure Google's Android has a similar thing where you can, in a very data-driven way, see the apps that you're using and be informed that, I spent this much time on Instagram today. I'm going to set a limit, or I'm going to reduce that. Personally, that doesn't really fit my way of working. I try to stay away from numbers and just go, am I using this too much? Put it somewhere else. But other people, rely on that sort of thing, and it's for them. And I think it's really good that those features are there. I think that, though, is an assumption that responsibility of moderation and having healthy social media practices, that's putting the responsibility or the blame on the user. And there is responsibility there for sure. But at the same time, tech or social media companies that are doing this thing, they're creating and designing experiences that suck people in. There are algorithms feeding people information that not only fits their predetermined or tracked topics of interest, but what their friends are talking about. We're seeing this creation of like echo chambers that have been around forever. And to call out an example that I really enjoy, and it was actually the network where I made a lot of genuine long-term friends who I now podcast with, people within the community that I kind of call home specifically online, is micro.blog. Are you familiar with micro.blog?
No, actually.
Yeah. Now, not some sort of sponsorship relationship here or anything. I'm just an avid user of the platform and have made friends there. That's an example of a kind of, to use it, I would say it's like a hybrid of writing a WordPress blog with the brevity of something like Twitter as we knew it, right? And the interesting thing here, and the thing that would basically stop it from ever becoming mainstream, is that you have to pay for it. There are no ads on this platform, but it's also one of the most reasonably priced things that I've ever come across. And when you use it, you start to understand or unpack the things that have led you to becoming addicted to now traditional social media like Facebook, Instagram, and so on. You notice that there are no ads there. Things are chronological. And when you scroll to the end of the feed on your phone, it says show more. It's not an infinite scrolling timeline. So there are things that, if tech and social media companies that say, oh, we're all for the user and fostering, a more healthy environment, if they were serious about that, they could design into the product things like micro.blog, as I've experienced in a more niche or smaller scale social platform. They could put those in there if they wanted. So I think it's a balancing act for yourself as a user, but the balancing act, it takes two to tango. The companies have to do something as well.
Yeah, I want to follow a couple of thoughts out of that.
Sorry, it was a bit of a tirade.
No. It was good, but it set me off in so many different directions. I hope I don't lose any of it. The first one is that I noticed a little while ago that Instagram has implemented quiet mode. And now it made me think while you were talking, I need to actually look up what this is, because I had seen it come on and I say it's time for quiet mode, or your phone will go into quiet mode shortly. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like on Instagram, when I'm sitting there on Instagram too late at night and continually scrolling, and suddenly it says we're going to go into quiet mode shortly. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so quiet mode, it seems to turn on automatically, or perhaps it kind of gets used to your use patterns, and then if you're going beyond that, it wants to go quiet. So, but quiet mode, what it does is pause your notifications, change your activity status to quiet mode, and any DMs you get automatically get an auto reply, so that you can not use the app, I guess, or be encouraged to not use the app during quiet time. So I found that really interesting when I noticed it had basically, maybe I clicked something to turn it on. You don't never know nowadays. But when I noticed these things starting to pop up on my feed or on my Instagram app. The other thing that I did a little bit of writing about recently was, and your comments on microblog brought me to this, and I've just had a look at some of the features. There's a bit of a trend towards what we might call the old internet, and I wrote a post in January, and I said the web is back as the title of this, because it felt to me like some of these emergent technologies or re-emergent technologies are actually bringing the web back to what it was 2 decades ago, or a decade ago perhaps. And in particular, figuring out for me that you can integrate ActivityPub with WordPress to give you your own kind of social network built into a WordPress blog, and that people on Mastodon then can use, because Mastodon's built on the ActivityPub protocol, can subscribe to your WordPress without you having to have Mastodon account um,
Mm,
was really interesting. And so, yeah, using ActivityPub across platforms and across networks, or other federated approaches, I think can start to bring back that user controlled internet a little bit more. So, the notion of the Fediverse is that you have this series of websites that all run these common protocols across, and content can then flow back and forth across them. And so we've even seen Tumblr using Fediverse technology, and Threads. Um, Even when I wrote this blog post, I wrote, yet even Meta promises, or is that threatens, that their newest site, Threads, will be federated.
mm,
Because once a platform like Meta, I think, adopts federation and adopts these user controlled approaches, suddenly we see potentially a whole new different approach to social media. A user controlled approach to social media. People can use their preferred platform but still subscribe to people on other platforms. And that means the content flowing back and forth between platforms isn't as subject to the algorithmic organization, hopefully. So I think that's interesting, and I'm keen to see how that shakes out. Although I'm not very certain on Meta's approach to these things, but or not very confident on Meta's approach to these things. But I guess we'll see.
yeah, and I'm so glad that you brought all of that up, because that activity pub or Fediverse idea is actually something that Micro.blog has been doing for the longest time too, that integration
Yeah,
with Mastodon, and that someone on Mastodon can follow you on Micro.blog, as you've just said with WordPress and Threads, even if you've never been on that particular
yeah,
network. So optimistically speaking, yes, it would be great if this is the future that grows and more people become used to that as a mainstream kind of practice. I just really hope that, assuming that Threads continues to follow on with all of this, that they don't kind of ensnare everybody and then change something down the line that essentially locks everyone back in or restricts that
yeah,
access to other things. Because you could see the biggest Fediverse player becoming Meta, and then they go, all right, well, that doesn't suit us anymore. We're going to reverse this. So I hope
yeah.
that's not the case. But yeah, let's be optimistic.
I think that's absolutely a major risk there. That everyone kind of becomes reliant on Threads, on Meta's infrastructure, and then they
Hmm.
pull the rug. Because certainly we've seen companies do that again and again. The other player in that space is Blue Sky,
Hmm.
of course, and they have similarly an open protocol, and they've just opened firstly, they've opened the platform to everybody, but they've also opened so different servers can run what they're calling the AT protocol, um, which is effectively does the same thing as ActivityPub, but I don't think they're interoperable, which is a shame. And so, yeah, you have to have some bridges between them. But yeah, the Blue Sky's another player in that space, and it'll be really interesting, I think, to see how all of this shakes out. But people owning their own infrastructure continues to be important as the social media companies change and
Hmm.
shake things up.
If I may ask you, I'm just curious, because it sounds like, if you work in or study communications or anything digital, you're going to be on a few different blogging or social media platforms. So where do
Mm.
you kind of find enjoyment, or the space that you like to nestle into and scroll through?
I still yearn for the old Twitter. Um,
Mm.
I had a Twitter account from 2006 or thereabouts, and I actually created it as at the request of my university lecturers, one of whom is your PhD supervisor, Chris Moore.
There you
Um,
go.
and so, yeah, that's full circle. But I deleted Twitter last year because of everything that was happening. I still have it for one of my podcasts. And so I kind of check in on the network, but that network is really very specialized compared to my sort of generic social graph that I had on Twitter previously. I have to say I do enjoy Instagram, but funnily enough, I have been finding a lot of solace and community and entertainment lately in Facebook groups. So back to the old Facebook, but particularly the groups, and finding groups with niche interests. And when I say niche interests, Simpsons shitposting groups in particular. So where people just post Simpsons memes and memes they create, and also more recently some Seinfeld shitposting groups and various groups like that. There's really interesting, funny people in a lot of those communities. So that's actually where I've been hanging out a lot the last 6 months. Yeah, but Twitter was my home on the internet, and I have a lot of regret and sadness about what happened there. So,
I share that. And look, Twitter was my home as well. But the funny thing in my case was that the highly specific or niche tech podcasting community that I'm actually exploring in my own PhD research basically went, we don't like this. We're
mm,
moving to Mastodon. So my Twitter account still exists. I check if people happen to contact me there, but I've left it, I suppose, just to keep that web integrity or those links alive, where I didn't do that with Facebook and Instagram. I deleted those years ago. But it was actually a surprisingly easy transition for me because the entire community that I was mostly there for on Twitter had moved to Mastodon. So it was essentially like a
mm,
social media transplant and a good case study for what happens when you have this public or this kind of social imaginary just deciding to move somewhere else. And then
yeah,
you see that tension of, well, actually, this is technically a different medium. This is a different space, and there are different affordances, and trying to work out what works and what doesn't. And oh, these people are here already, different diverse groups, whether that's talking cultural background or gender, and they might not fit the modes of communication that you had in your public.
yeah. Um, I have accounts on multiple accounts on Mastodon, and I have
Mm.
Blue Sky accounts as well, and I have Threads accounts. So I do use and post to all of them, as well as my ActivityPub integration with my WordPress sites. So there's a
There
lot.
are many
There's a lot.
Travises out there. So many
Yeah,
Travises. Yeah.
that's yeah. It's like a multiverse of Travises. While we're thinking about social media, I had an interesting conversation with someone this morning who this is a lady who is not as terminally online as me, but also I guess as many millennials. She's slightly older than that. And the conversation during the course of the conversation, she mentioned something about Facebook and how she gets propositioned through DMs on Facebook semi regularly, and she was very much put off by this. She didn't know why they were finding her and messaging her. She didn't know how to respond or how to deal with it, so she didn't have access to the or an understanding of how to access the tools to use the block tools and things like that. And I thought this was an interesting question because it suddenly occurred to me that, she actually said to me, um, Mark Zuckerberg created this to pick up women, and that's what they think they can use it for. And I thought, that's really interesting because I had never
Mm.
conceived of Facebook, even though I knew those kinds of facts of how Facebook was founded during Zuckerberg's college days. I had never conceived of it as a network at whose core is picking people up, hitting on people. And even though a lot of people wouldn't see it that way, I started to wonder how, that's there in the DNA. You can never really get rid of that, right? It's like the first affordance of Facebook is to contact people you like um, sexually. And so, how do you get rid of that? You can't police your way out of that paper bag, your meta. And I think they've really struggled with that. And women on the internet know this all too well. That struggle of constantly being approached or propositioned. So yeah, I don't know what I have to say about that except it strikes me as again as the first affordance of Facebook was for that purpose, and so therefore you're never going to be able to get away from it.
Yeah, fantastic point. And I'm glad you brought it up because there'd be a lot of people in, I suppose, privileged white male positions who never really have to think about or deal with this sort of thing. It's other groups, and women aren't a minority. They're like half the planet.
Yeah.
But it gets into that question of software bias or who's designing these things. Because, I mean, and you can look at things beyond social media, like why are so many virtual assistants female by default? What does that say
Mm.
about the character or the persona of a social media or a virtual assistant? You know, you've got even things like, I suppose, Cortana is the Microsoft equivalent from, you know, Halo, and who's playing Halo stereotypically. With, you know, that's a whole kind of cultural thing as well. So I think that's a good question to kind of pose. And it also made me think while you were speaking there about being able to contact anyone. Uh, we had a thing like the yellow or the white pages for years and years. The idea that you could, you know, watch the original Terminator of like Arnold Schwarzenegger flicking through to find all the Sarah Connors and where they live, right? Or the home phones or something. So it's not a new idea that anyone could just be instantly contacted or found, but it's a little bit more terrifying or problematic in the way that you've raised really well. Sorry if you can hear thunderclaps and rain in the background. Yeah, we'll see if that makes of the recording. But yeah, this idea that when you run a Facebook account or you have a profile for yourself, I think people don't always have a great idea of what's public. There's this blurring of the private and public worlds because they might have privacy controls on or what they make visible, but it's still this public asset, this persona that you're presenting on the internet. Now, the white or the yellow pages for individuals or businesses, yeah, you were offering something about yourself or saying where you lived or worked or what your number was, but you didn't have your entire life story underneath that little thing in the list. So I think it is more problematic that these things have been designed by a certain type of people or type of person. They haven't thought about those consequences, and the fact that everyone's personal details may be on show if they haven't toggled things in the appropriate way,
Yeah.
and that they're contacted as a result of that. So
I mean, even if your
it's difficult.
profile is totally locked down, you have your name and a photo,
Yeah,
ideally a photo, or you know, some kind of representative image. And I think particularly for women, that's a challenge. Um, yeah, so the technology certainly is built from the ground up to facilitate these things, and then, as I say, to try and police or figure out technological ways out of that is an interesting challenge.
mm,
Um, the even the notion of the thunder there in the background makes me think about our relationship to technology, because we inhabit cyberspace, but at the same time our bodies are still in physical real locations, right? And so even if you're wearing a pair of Apple Vision Pro, still every chance you'll fall in a fountain, or like there's a real space around you
yeah.
and there's
Don't
other
walk with
real
it on.
people around you. So hearing the thunder in the background just makes me realize, you know, we are you're sitting in your house down there in the Illawarra, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep, that's it.
that's just where we know each other from. So I just made that assumption. And I'm out here in Bathurst in the Central West. We don't currently have the storms, but it connects the locations together, and you're still sitting there in a physical space which has got some rain and thunder coming down. So uh,
Absolutely.
even that challenges the notion of the internet as its own space, separate from us.
Yeah. And that's, you know, we were talking about opportunities and challenges with convergent technology earlier, or convergence culture. That's, I suppose, one of the pros and cons equally of social media. Like right now, you and I can see each other and we're framed very literally by the screen or the camera that we're using, right? When we interact with technologies on the web and we have Facebook accounts or blogs or something connected through the Fediverse, whatever you want, we are framing ourselves and presenting an ideal version of ourselves that people can choose to adopt or
Mm,
they just take in. So, on the one hand, that's a pro because you're in control of your image and you get to choose who you are online and what you show from your surrounding physical world. But then I suppose the negative is that if people just stumble into your persona online, maybe you've been writing as an expert on a topic for years, or you're a tech podcast commentator or a YouTuber on that. People only see what you decide to present and don't know about the rest of you, nor should they really if that's your choice. But they will make judgments or uh, have certain viewpoints about your behavior identity because they don't know about the rest of you. And
mm,
that can even bring into ideas, bring into discussion things like harassment or, what do you know? We're only presenting part of ourselves online.
Yeah. I saw you quite often see that someone will make a post that's local to their geography or their cultural context, and people will respond to it without that same cultural context, and suddenly
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a thing where it wasn't that previously. And so yeah, I always find that interesting, and without stereotyping too much, it seems to often be Americans that kind of assume everyone's talking about America when they jump in, or so
Yeah.
yeah, that's always interesting. So
Or even, I don't know if you saw the discussions on, I never, it never feels right calling it X, but X now, right? Twitter/X. These discussions that Americans were having with aerial views of the MCG
yes,
with the Taylor
yes,
Swift concert. It's like,
yeah,
where's the parking? What's going on? Their entire frame of reference being, you go to a concert, you drive and you have a gigantic car park. And all the Melburnians are saying, no, we caught the tram or the bus or the taxi and we use public transport. So yeah, you end up in this kind of strangely nationally restricted echo chamber of America, or
yeah,
pick your country, and then you see the opposite and you're puzzled. So
yeah.
for all of globalism and internet convergence culture, we're still bound by where we live, as you've suggested, I think.
That's a really good note to end this conversation on. Actually, Martin, there's been so many interesting topics there and so much to chew on. Thank you so much for jumping on to Digital Society for a chat.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Martin Feld for joining me on Digital Society. If you want to check out Martin's work, go to www.rsspod.net. That's www.rsspod.net to check out his podcast, Really Specific Stories, in which he delves into narratives of the tech podcast fandom and the role of open RSS. Or check out martinfeld.info. That's Martin, FELD.info for all his links. Thanks again, Martin. Thanks for listening. Background music by Audio Coffee.